If you had walked the muddy, unpaved streets of Washington, D.C. in the agonizing, rain-soaked week following the First Battle of Bull Run, you would have witnessed the absolute terrifying nadir of the American Republic. The city was drowning in despair. The relentless, freezing summer rain had turned the grand avenues of the nation's capital into deep, impassable rivers of brown sludge. And lying completely exposed in that freezing mud, sleeping on the cold marble steps of the United States Capitol building, huddled in the filthy gutters, and crowded onto the wooden porches of terrified citizens were the completely shattered, traumatized remnants of the United States Army. These were the boys who, just a week earlier, had marched out of the city with bright, clean uniforms, singing patriotic songs, genuinely believing they were invincible. Now they were a completely dissolved, deeply humiliated, and deeply terrified mob. They had thrown away their heavy muskets in their blind panic to escape the battlefield. They had lost their officers. They had lost their pride. And far worse than the loss of their military equipment, they had entirely lost their faith in the government that had blindly sent them into the meat grinder. Inside the executive mansion, the atmosphere was one of suffocating, paralyzing panic. President Abraham Lincoln had not slept in days. He paced the long, shadowed hallways of the White House, receiving frantic, terrifying telegrams from northern governors demanding to know how the Grand Army had been so effortlessly, violently crushed. The political establishment in Washington was entirely convinced that the victorious Confederate Army was at that very moment marching directly toward the Potomac River to burn the Capitol to the absolute ground. He was 34 years old. He was relatively short, incredibly stocky, and built like a highly compressed spring. He possessed a massive barrel-shaped chest, a flawless, perfectly manicured reddish mustache, and eyes that burn with absolute, supreme, almost terrifying self-assurance. He stepped onto the platform wearing a pristine, custom-tailored, immaculate blue uniform adorned with gleaming gold stars. His heavy leather boots were polished to a mirror shine. While the rest of the city was drowning in absolute panic and paralyzing fear, this man radiated an aura of total, unbreakable control. His name was Major General George Brinton McClellan. When George McClellan rode his massive black warhorse through the muddy streets of Washington, the psychological effect on the traumatized city was absolutely instantaneous and nothing short of miraculous. The politicians breathed a massive sigh of relief. The terrified civilians cheered wildly from their balconies, and the exhausted, defeated, demoralized soldiers sitting in the mud looked up at this magnificent, shining, supremely confident figure, and they instantly, deeply, and unconditionally fell in love with him. The Northern press, completely starved for a genuine hero to write about, immediately dubbed him the young Napoleon. McClellan rode directly to the White House. He walked into the executive office, looked the exhausted, towering Abraham Lincoln directly in the eye, and with a voice utterly devoid of doubt, he made a promise that would define the entire first half of the American Civil War. He told the president, "I can do it all." This is video 45 of our series. Today we witness the absolute miracle and the agonizing tragedy of the Army of the Potomac. We are going to explore the brilliant, deeply flawed, and incredibly complex mind of George B. McClellan. We will watch him perform a true administrative miracle, taking a broken, chaotic mob of terrified boys and methodically forging them into the greatest, most sophisticated, and most magnificent military machine the North American continent has ever seen. But we will also watch in mounting, agonizing, and infuriating horror as the so-called savior of the Union completely, tragically loses his grip on reality. We will explore the fatal psychological flaw that paralyzed him, his intense, burning contempt for the President of the United States, and the tragic reality of a man who built the most beautiful, lethal sword in the world, but was utterly, absolutely terrified of drawing it from its scabbard.
To understand the dizzying, meteoric rise of George B. McClellan, and to understand the fatal, paralyzing hubris that would ultimately orchestrate his spectacular downfall, you have to understand exactly how he was raised and what he was trained to believe about himself. George Brinton McClellan was not a rugged, self-made frontiersman who chopped wood in a log cabin. He was not a humble, self-taught lawyer from the muddy backwoods of Illinois like Abraham Lincoln. McClellan was an American aristocrat. He was born into immense privilege in Philadelphia in 1826. His father was a highly prominent, incredibly wealthy, and highly respected surgical doctor. From the exact moment he was born, George was absolutely surrounded by the finest education, the most elite social circles, and a deeply ingrained cultural expectation of absolute greatness. He possessed an intellect that genuinely, effortlessly intimidated almost everyone in the room. He was a legitimate child prodigy. He was so incredibly brilliant that he was accepted into the prestigious United States Military Academy at West Point at the impossibly young age of 15, requiring a special, highly unusual legal waiver just to be admitted because he was technically too young to serve. At West Point, McClellan thrived in the rigid, mathematical, perfectly ordered environment of military engineering. He graduated second in his massive class in 1846. He did not merely study war, he studied the profound mathematics of logistics, the precise geometry of fortifications, and the highly complex science of moving massive bodies of men across difficult terrain. Immediately upon graduating, the young prodigy was violently thrust into the Mexican-American War, and what he witnessed in the scorching deserts of Mexico permanently, fundamentally shaped his entire philosophy of how a war should be fought. During the brilliant, incredibly successful campaign against Mexico City, McClellan served as a trusted engineering officer under the legendary towering General Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott was a master of the grand, methodical siege. Scott did not believe in reckless, bloody, chaotic frontal assaults that wasted the lives of his precious men. Instead, Scott utilized massive, overwhelming artillery barrages, brilliant, highly organized logistical supply chains, and incredibly complex, bloodless flanking maneuvers to force the enemy to surrender without a massive fight. McClellan watched this methodical, scientific approach to warfare succeed brilliantly. He also watched the terrifying, chaotic, undisciplined behavior of the amateur volunteer politicians who were fighting in the army.
McClellan walked away from Mexico with two absolute, unshakable core beliefs. First, he believed that war was a pure science that should only be conducted by highly trained, elite professionals using overwhelming preparation. Second, he developed a deep, permanent, and intensely toxic hatred for civilian politicians interfering in military affairs. Recognizing his immense, undeniable brilliance, the United States government sent Captain McClellan on a highly prestigious, vital intelligence mission to Europe in 1855. His objective was to officially observe the massive, industrialized, brutal conflict unfolding in the Crimean War, where the massive empires of Great Britain, France, and Russia were slaughtering each other using modern technology. McClellan meticulously, obsessively studied the massive European armies. He studied their logistics, their cavalry formations, their trench systems, and their massive sieges. He even returned to the United States and entirely redesigned the official cavalry saddle used by the Army, the famous McClellan saddle, which was so brilliantly engineered that the United States military continued to use it for almost a century. But by 1857, the slow, highly bureaucratic peacetime promotion system of the tiny United States Army frustrated his immense ambition. McClellan resigned his military commission and entered the incredibly lucrative, fast-paced, cutthroat world of the booming American railroad industry. He rapidly became a highly paid, incredibly powerful chief engineer, and eventually the president of the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad. He was managing millions of dollars in capital. He was coordinating the incredibly complex logistics of thousands of workers, tons of steel, and massive continent-spanning schedules. He was a master of the new, highly industrialized corporate age. When the Civil War finally violently erupted in 1861, McClellan was uniquely, perfectly suited to handle the unprecedented scale of the crisis. He had commanded men in combat. He had studied the massive, highly organized armies of Europe, and he knew exactly how to utilize the massive industrial capacity of the railroad to move incredible amounts of material. He was, without a single doubt, the most qualified military administrator on the entire North American continent. And when Abraham Lincoln handed him the shattered, deeply traumatized, disorganized mob of survivors shivering in the mud of Washington, D.C., George B. McClellan went to work.
When George McClellan took absolute command of the federal forces around Washington in late July of 1861, he did not inherit a functioning army. He inherited a profoundly traumatized, highly disease-ridden, heavily armed mob of deeply depressed boys. But McClellan possessed a true, undeniable administrative genius. He possessed an organizational capacity that bordered on the superhuman.
The very first thing he did was brutally, methodically assert absolute control over the physical environment of the city. McClellan instituted martial law and established a massive, heavily armed provost guard, essentially an incredibly strict military police force. He ordered his provost guards to relentlessly sweep the taverns, the brothels, and the muddy alleyways of the capital. Any soldier found wandering the streets without an official signed military pass was immediately arrested, heavily fined, and thrown into the guardhouse. The casual, relaxed, deeply democratic, and wildly undisciplined atmosphere of the 90-day volunteers was permanently, violently crushed. Next, he turned his massive intellect toward the horrifying, entirely invisible enemy that was killing more Union soldiers than Confederate bullets: disease. In the summer of 1861, the Union camps around Washington were horrific, disease-ridden cesspools. Men were dying by the hundreds from dysentery, typhoid fever, and cholera simply because they did not understand basic 19th century sanitation. They were drinking the exact same river water they were using for their latrines. McClellan ruthlessly enforced basic, life-saving hygiene. He forced the regiments to physically move their camps to high, well-drained ground. He mandated the construction of incredibly deep, meticulously maintained latrines located far away from the fresh water supplies. He forced the men to bathe regularly. He ensured that massive, endless trains of supply wagons continuously delivered high-quality, heavily inspected rations, clean uniforms, fresh leather boots, and high-quality canvas tents. In a matter of mere weeks, the massive death rate from disease plummeted. The men were warm, they were incredibly well fed, and they were finally healthy. And once he had them healthy, he began to drill them. McClellan understood that the profound terror and chaos of Bull Run had occurred because the men did not trust their officers, and they did not know how to automatically, instinctively execute battlefield maneuvers under heavy fire. He instituted a brutal, relentless, entirely exhausting regimen of daily military drill.
Men marched for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours a single day under the blistering late summer sun. They practiced loading their heavy Springfield rifled muskets until their fingers literally bled and the motions became pure, unthinking muscle memory. They practiced forming complex squares to repel cavalry. They practiced shifting from a marching column into a perfectly straight geometric line of battle in a matter of seconds. He fired the incompetent, politically appointed, heavily drinking officers who had failed at Bull Run. He replaced them with highly trained, deeply professional West Point graduates who knew exactly how to enforce absolute, unyielding military discipline. And as the weeks turned into months, a profound, almost magical psychological transformation occurred. McClellan organized massive, awe-inspiring spectacles known as Grand Reviews. He would gather 50,000, sometimes 70,000 highly disciplined troops on a massive open plain. He would dress in his finest uniform, mount his massive black warhorse, and gallop at top speed down the endless, perfectly straight lines of blue-clad men, surrounded by a massive, glittering entourage of staff officers and foreign dignitaries. When the men saw him, they didn't just cheer. They absolutely wildly, frantically roared. The sound of 50,000 men screaming his name was deafening. They threw their blue forage caps high into the air. They wept openly with absolute, overwhelming pride. They lovingly, devotedly called him Little Mac. You must understand the profound, incredibly deep psychological bond that formed between George McClellan and his soldiers. He had taken them when they were absolutely terrified, covered in mud, shivering in the rain, feeling like complete, humiliated failures. He had fed them, he had clothed them, he had protected them from the brutal politicians, and most importantly, he had given them back their sacred, unbreakable sense of masculine honor. He made them look at themselves in the mirror and see invincible, professional soldiers. By the autumn of 1861, George B. McClellan had accomplished one of the greatest, most astonishing logistical and administrative feats in the entire history of human warfare. He had taken a shattered, disorganized, heavily armed mob, and he had methodically, brilliantly forged them into the Army of the Potomac. It was the largest, best-equipped, most highly trained, and most terrifyingly sophisticated military machine the North American continent had ever seen. It was a magnificent, polished, razor-sharp sword, perfectly capable of marching south, completely annihilating the Confederate rebellion and ending the American Civil War.
There was only one massive, catastrophic, and completely fatal problem. Having spent months meticulously building this beautiful, pristine, incredible machine, George McClellan was absolutely, utterly terrified of breaking it. To understand the absolute tragedy of George Britton McClellan, you have to understand the fatal, paralyzing psychological flaw that existed deep inside his brilliant, highly mathematical mind. McClellan was a master engineer, and engineers deal in the realm of absolute, undeniable certainty. They calculate weight, tension, and physics to exact, mathematically perfect decimal points. When an engineer builds a bridge, he must know without a single shadow of a doubt that the bridge will hold the exact weight of the train crossing it. If there is even a fractional percent of uncertainty, the engineer will not allow the train to cross. But war is absolutely not a science of certainty. War is the absolute realm of shadows, chaos, friction, and terrifying ambiguity. George McClellan possessed an intellect capable of building a magnificent, perfectly balanced military machine, but he completely, utterly lacked the brutal, gambler's nerve required to actually throw that machine into the violent, unpredictable chaos of combat. He was psychologically incapable of acting unless he believed he possessed absolute, perfect knowledge of the enemy and a mathematically guaranteed certainty of victory. And in his desperate, obsessive, blinding quest to find that perfect certainty, he hired exactly the wrong man. Sitting across the map table from General McClellan was a Scottish immigrant named Alan Pinkerton. Before the Civil War, Pinkerton had gained immense national fame by founding the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. He was a brilliant, highly effective civilian police detective, famous for solving complex railroad robberies and busting localized counterfeiting rings in Chicago. Because Pinkerton had successfully foiled a rumored assassination plot against Abraham Lincoln in Baltimore before the inauguration, McClellan, who had worked with Pinkerton in the railroad industry, hired him to serve as his personal, absolute chief of military intelligence. It was a catastrophic, completely ruinous appointment. Alan Pinkerton was a fantastic civilian detective, but he had absolutely no experience whatsoever in the highly complex, deeply nuanced art of large-scale military intelligence gathering.
Pinkerton and his network of civilian spies went to work trying to calculate the exact size of the Confederate Army camped at Manassas, but their methodology was profoundly, mathematically, and catastrophically flawed. Pinkerton's agents would sneak behind enemy lines and attempt to count Confederate campfires in the dark, multiplying the number of fires by an assumed number of men per fire. But the Confederate commanders, fully aware that Union spies were watching, routinely engaged in deliberate, highly theatrical deception. They would order their men to build hundreds of extra, completely unmanned campfires every single night, stretching for miles into the empty woods, creating the terrifying visual illusion of a massive, sprawling army. Furthermore, Pinkerton heavily relied on interrogating captured Confederate deserters and newly escaped enslaved people. These incredibly vulnerable people, sitting terrified in a Union interrogation tent, quickly realized that their aggressive interrogators were obsessed with hearing about massive, terrifying enemy numbers. Desperate to please their captors, to seem valuable, or simply to survive, these informants vastly, wildly exaggerated the size of the rebel forces. Pinkerton, who possessed no military baseline to filter this raw, contaminated data, simply compiled every rumor, every exaggerated campfire count, and every terrified confession, added them all together, and presented the final official intelligence reports directly to George McClellan. The numbers Pinkerton delivered to McClellan were completely, staggeringly, and fabulously wrong. In the autumn of 1861, the Confederate Army camped at Manassas consisted of roughly 40,000 exhausted, poorly equipped men. They were desperately short on food, suffering from horrific outbreaks of disease, and entirely incapable of launching an offensive against the heavily fortified capital. But Alan Pinkerton looked General McClellan directly in the eye and handed him official, classified reports explicitly stating that the Confederate Army was a massive, highly disciplined, terrifying juggernaut of 150,000 men. Pinkerton claimed the rebels heavily outnumbered the Army of the Potomac by a ratio of almost 2-to-1. And this is where the profound, deeply tragic psychological flaw of George McClellan fully metastasized. Any objective, highly trained military commander would have looked at those staggering numbers, looked at the logistical impossibility of the South feeding 150,000 men in a single camp, and instantly dismissed the report as complete fiction.
But McClellan did not dismiss it. He enthusiastically, obsessively embraced it. He swallowed the terrifying lie whole. Why? Because the lie of a massive, overwhelmingly superior enemy perfectly, flawlessly protected George McClellan's incredibly fragile ego. If the Confederate Army was truly 150,000 men strong, then McClellan's absolute refusal to march out and attack them was not an act of military cowardice or paralyzing indecision. It was an act of supreme, brilliant, patriotic prudence. If he was hopelessly outnumbered, then the fact that he was keeping the Union Army safe inside the defenses of Washington proved that he was a brilliant, cautious savior protecting the Republic from certain annihilation. He wrote frantic, deeply paranoid letters to his wife Ellen, explicitly claiming that he was the only man standing between the United States and total destruction, and that he was facing a terrifying, overwhelming monster just across the river. He completely convinced himself of his own manufactured reality. The absolute humiliating climax of this intelligence disaster would not be fully exposed until the early spring of 1862. After months of refusing to move, McClellan's massive army finally cautiously advanced toward the Confederate lines at Centreville, fully expecting a horrific, apocalyptic battle against Pinkerton's mythical 150,000-man juggernaut. But when the Union troops finally crept up to the massive, imposing Confederate earthen forts, they found them completely, totally abandoned. The Confederate Army, fully realizing they were vastly outnumbered, had quietly, cleanly retreated south toward Richmond days earlier. But as the Union troops climbed over the dirt walls of the abandoned forts, they made a discovery that would make George McClellan the absolute laughingstock of the Northern press. From a distance of a mile away, through the brass spyglasses of Allan Pinkerton's agents, the forts appeared to be bristling with hundreds of massive, heavy iron siege cannons. But as the Union infantrymen walked up and actually touched the guns, they realized they were not made of iron. They were completely fake. The Confederate Army, lacking real artillery, had simply chopped down dozens of thick pine logs, stripped the bark, painted the wood flat black, and mounted them on old wagon wheels in the dirt embrasures. They were famously dubbed Quaker guns, named after the pacifist religious sect, because they could not fire a single shot.
For nearly 8 agonizing, highly expensive, deeply frustrating months, the magnificent 120,000-man Army of the Potomac, the greatest military machine on the continent, had been completely paralyzed, held absolutely hostage, not by a massive, invincible Confederate army, but by a few dozen painted logs and the terrified, paranoid imagination of its commanding general. But the devastating paranoia of George McClellan was not entirely focused on the Confederate enemy waiting in Virginia. In his deeply compartmentalized, highly arrogant mind, the greatest, most dangerous enemies to his grand vision were not wearing gray uniforms. They were wearing civilian suits, and they were sitting in the White House. If you were to search the entire sweeping history of the United States of America, you would be incredibly hard-pressed to find 2 men more diametrically, fundamentally, and culturally opposed to one another than President Abraham Lincoln and General George B. McClellan. Their relationship was an absolute, unmitigated psychological disaster from the very moment it began, and it profoundly, deeply crippled the Union war effort for over a year. To George McClellan, a man born into intense wealth, raised in high society, and educated at the absolute elite institutions of the country, Abraham Lincoln was an uneducated, unrefined, completely unqualified frontier buffoon. McClellan was a wealthy, conservative, aristocratic Democrat. He utterly despised the radical anti-slavery wing of the Republican Party. He believed the war should be fought strictly as a polite, gentlemanly, and highly localized dispute over constitutional boundaries, and he was absolutely violently opposed to any political action that would interfere with the Southern institution of slavery. He wanted to win the war, but he wanted to win it without fundamentally changing the social fabric of the United States. McClellan did not just quietly disagree with the president's politics, he harbored a deep, visceral, almost toxic personal contempt for the man. In a series of incredibly arrogant, deeply revealing private letters written to his wife Ellen, McClellan frequently openly mocked the commander-in-chief of the United States. He referred to Abraham Lincoln as a well-meaning baboon, an idiot, and most famously and insultingly, the original guerrilla. He viewed Lincoln's cabinet members as meddling, ignorant, cowardly civilian politicians who knew absolutely nothing about the complex science of war and who were actively, deliberately trying to sabotage his grand, magnificent army to further their own radical political careers.
And as the autumn of 1861 dragged on, and the magnificent Army of the Potomac sat completely idle in its pristine camps around Washington, the intense political friction between the general and the president finally reached an explosive, incredibly disrespectful breaking point. On the freezing evening of November 13, 1861, President Abraham Lincoln, his Secretary of State William Seward, and his young personal secretary John Hay walked through the dark, muddy streets of Washington. They were not summoning the general to the White House. Lincoln, who possessed absolutely zero personal ego and cared only about winning the war, frequently, humbly, walked directly to McClellan's opulent private residence to gently inquire about the general's operational plans. When the President of the United States knocked on the massive oak door, the servant answered and politely informed them that General McClellan was currently attending an officer's wedding but was expected back shortly. Lincoln, showing immense patience, stepped into the lavishly decorated parlor and quietly sat down to wait. For nearly a full hour, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States military sat quietly in the parlor of his subordinate officer, patiently waiting for him to return home. Finally, they heard the heavy front door open. General McClellan stepped into the grand hallway. The servant immediately approached him, took his heavy wool coat, and explicitly, clearly informed the general that the President of the United States and the Secretary of State were currently sitting in the parlor, eagerly waiting to speak with him. McClellan paused in the hallway. He looked toward the parlor door. And then, in an act of breathtaking, almost inconceivable military insubordination and sheer personal arrogance, McClellan completely ignored them. He walked directly past the parlor, marched heavily up the wooden staircase, and disappeared into his private second-floor quarters. Lincoln and his aides waited for another 30 agonizing minutes. The silence in the house became suffocating. Finally, John Hay, absolutely furious at the disrespect, summoned the servant and demanded to know when the general would be coming down to receive the president. The servant, looking completely mortified and deeply embarrassed, walked back down the stairs and quietly informed the president that General McClellan had officially retired for the evening, had completely undressed, and had gone to sleep. He had intentionally, deliberately gone to bed while the President of the United States was waiting in his living room. John Hay was absolutely livid. He believed the general should be immediately arrested for insubordination and court-martialed. Secretary Seward was deeply insulted. But Abraham Lincoln did not fly into a rage. He did not pound his fist on the table or demand respect. Lincoln, carrying the agonizing, crushing weight of a fractured nation on his shoulders, completely swallowed his own personal pride. He understood that McClellan was beloved by the army and that firing him right now would shatter the fragile morale of the troops. As they walked back out into the freezing, dark Washington night, Lincoln looked at his furious secretary, John Hay, and delivered a quote that perfectly, tragically encapsulated his desperate, heartbreaking pragmatism. Lincoln softly replied, "I will hold McClellan's horse if he will only bring us success." But the success Lincoln so desperately craved, the victory he was willing to suffer deep personal humiliation to achieve, simply did not come. As the autumn of 1861 slowly turned into the bitter, freezing, and impassable mud of the Virginia winter, the magnificent Army of the Potomac sat completely, totally paralyzed in its pristine camps. They drilled, they polished their brass, they ate their rations, and they did absolutely nothing else. The Northern public, the press, and the radical politicians in Congress began to completely lose their minds with furious impatience. A deeply cynical, profoundly mocking phrase began to appear in massive black ink across the front pages of Northern newspapers every single day. The newspaper simply printed, "All quiet on the Potomac." It began as a statement of fact. It rapidly became a bitter, furious insult. Abraham Lincoln's patience finally completely snapped in early 1862. He famously, sarcastically remarked to a group of politicians that if General McClellan did not currently want to use the army, the president would very much like to borrow it for a time. McClellan could no longer hide behind the winter mud. He was finally absolutely forced by the furious political pressure in Washington to actually draw the magnificent, expensive sword he had built and plunge it directly into the heart of the Confederacy.
But George McClellan, ever the brilliant, cautious engineer, absolutely refused to march his pristine army straight down the muddy, heavily defended overland roads toward Richmond.
He was going to utilize the massive, overwhelming industrial might of the United States Navy to execute one of the most audacious, massive, and incredibly complex logistical operations in the history of human warfare. He was going to bypass the rebel army entirely. He was going to attack Richmond through the back door. General George McClellan, staring at the vast, muddy overland routes between Washington and Richmond, recognized a fundamental, horrifying military reality. If he marched straight down those roads, his supply lines would be incredibly long, highly vulnerable to Confederate cavalry raids, and his army would be forced to fight dozens of bloody, head-on battles across multiple fortified rivers. He didn't want to fight a bloody war of attrition. He wanted to execute a brilliant, bloodless, Napoleonic masterstroke. His grand strategy was absolutely breathtaking in its massive industrial scale. Utilizing the overwhelming absolute superiority of the United States Navy, McClellan planned to load his entire 120,000-man Army of the Potomac on hundreds of massive transport ships. He would sail them down the Chesapeake Bay, completely bypassing the Confederate Army waiting in Northern Virginia. He would land his massive army on the tip of the Virginia Peninsula, the exact same historic piece of land where George Washington had cornered the British at Yorktown 80 years earlier. From the tip of the peninsula, McClellan would march his massive army rapidly, aggressively up the narrow neck of land, utilizing the deep rivers on either side to safely supply his troops with Navy transport ships. He would arrive at the back door of the Confederate capital, Richmond, before the rebel army in the north even realized what was happening. He would capture the city, end the rebellion, and win the war in a single, brilliant campaign. In March of 1862, the grand operation began. The logistical movement of the Army of the Potomac down the Chesapeake Bay is still, to this day, one of the greatest, most successful amphibious military movements in the entire history of the world. In a matter of mere weeks, McClellan successfully, safely transported over 100,000 men, 14,000 horses and mules, 3,000 massive supply wagons, and hundreds of heavy artillery pieces entirely by water. When the massive fleet arrived at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula, they disembarked and began their rapid march toward Richmond. But the brilliant, rapid Napoleonic march to Richmond slammed to a violent, humiliating halt almost immediately. Just a few miles up the peninsula, near the historic town of Yorktown, McClellan's massive army encountered a Confederate defensive line stretching completely across the narrow neck of land. The Confederate forces holding this line were commanded by a brilliant, highly theatrical, and deeply manipulative officer named Major General John B. Magruder. Magruder had a massive, fatal problem. He only had 11,000 men to hold the line. McClellan had over 100,000 men staring at him. If McClellan simply ordered his massive army to charge forward, they would absolutely, effortlessly crush Magruder's tiny force in an hour. But Magruder knew exactly who he was fighting. He knew George McClellan was a cautious, highly paranoid engineer who desperately relied on the flawed intelligence of Alan Pinkerton. So, Magruder put on an elaborate, highly successful theatrical production. He ordered his men to frantically chop down trees and paint them black, creating dozens of highly visible Quaker guns to intimidate the Union artillery. He ordered his men to constantly blow bugles, beat drums, and light hundreds of fake campfires in the dark woods. Most brilliantly, he took his single 11,000-man force and marched them endlessly in massive, continuous circles through the clearings. Through the brass spyglasses of the Union commanders, it genuinely looked like tens of thousands of fresh Confederate reinforcements were constantly pouring into the trenches. The deception worked perfectly. The fatal, paralyzing psychological flaw of George McClellan took absolute control. Alan Pinkerton, completely fooled by the marching circles and the fake cannons, handed McClellan intelligence reports stating that Magruder commanded a massive, terrifying army of over 100,000 men. McClellan believed the lie completely. He immediately halted the rapid advance of the Army of the Potomac. Instead of aggressively attacking, the great engineer defaulted to the slow, methodical science he had learned in Mexico. He ordered his massive army to stop, dig deep, miserable, mud-filled trenches in the sweltering Virginia swamps, and begin constructing a massive, highly complex European-style siege. For a full month, the greatest army on the continent was completely, humiliatingly paralyzed by a theatrical performance. Union soldiers spent weeks waist-deep in the freezing swamp water, suffering horrific outbreaks of malaria, digging massive zigzag siege trenches, and building massive wooden platforms to hold the heaviest artillery pieces in the world. By early May, McClellan had finally methodically moved his massive siege guns into place. He was prepared to unleash an apocalyptic, earth-shattering bombardment that would completely obliterate the Confederate lines. But on the exact morning the massive guns were finally scheduled to open fire, the Union troops woke up, peered over the muddy rims of their trenches, and found the Confederate fortifications completely, chillingly empty. McClellan had never intended to fight a massive battle. He was simply buying precious, vital time for the rest of the Confederate Army to concentrate and build massive permanent defenses closer to Richmond. Having successfully delayed the massive Union Army for a full month, the rebels simply packed up their camps in the middle of the night and safely retreated up the peninsula. McClellan had won the siege without firing his massive guns, but the month-long delay was completely, utterly fatal to his grand, rapid strategy. He slowly pushed his massive army up the peninsula, slogging through the deep mud, constantly complaining to Washington that he was heavily outnumbered, constantly demanding more men, and constantly blaming Abraham Lincoln for not supporting him. By late May, the massive Army of the Potomac had finally ground its way to the very outskirts of Richmond. They were so incredibly close to the Confederate capital that Union soldiers could hear the church bells ringing in the city squares. But they were about to encounter a man who was the absolute polar opposite of George McClellan, a man who possessed the brilliant, aggressive, gambling nerve that McClellan so fatally lacked. On May 31, 1862, the Confederate Army desperately launched an incredibly poorly coordinated, highly chaotic attack against McClellan's forces at the Battle of Seven Pines, just outside Richmond. During the fierce, confused fighting in the dense woods, the commanding general of the Confederate Army, Joseph E. Johnston, was severely wounded by an exploding Union artillery shell and physically carried off the battlefield on a stretcher.
The Confederate Army was completely leaderless. The massive 100,000-man Union Army was sitting just 5 miles outside the gates of their capital. The situation was absolutely, existentially desperate. Confederate President Jefferson Davis urgently needed a new commander. He turned to his chief military advisor, a quiet, intensely dignified, gray-haired man who had spent the first year of the war sitting behind a desk in Richmond, mocked by the Southern press as Granny because of his perceived caution. His name was Robert E. Lee. When Lee took command of the newly christened Army of Northern Virginia on June 1, 1862, he recognized exactly what kind of man he was fighting. He knew George McClellan intimately from their time serving together in Mexico. Lee knew that McClellan was an incredibly brilliant, methodical engineer, but more importantly, Lee knew that McClellan was deeply paranoid, utterly terrified of taking risks, and completely psychologically incapable of handling sudden, highly aggressive chaos. Robert E. Lee possessed a massive, brilliant, almost terrifyingly aggressive gambling nerve. He understood that if he simply sat in the trenches around Richmond and waited for McClellan to slowly build his massive siege guns, the Confederate capital would inevitably be completely pulverized, and the war would be lost. He had to attack. He had to seize the psychological initiative. He had to violently break the mind of George McClellan. In late June of 1862, Robert E. Lee launched a series of massive, incredibly aggressive, incredibly complex, and incredibly bloody counterattacks known to history as the 7 Days Battles. Tactically, Lee's attacks were often highly disjointed, incredibly poorly coordinated, and resulted in horrific, staggering Confederate casualties. Lee lost thousands more men than McClellan did during the campaign. But Lee wasn't fighting the Union Army. He was fighting the deeply fragile, paranoid psychology of its commanding general. The sheer, overwhelming aggressiveness of Lee's continuous daily attacks completely shattered George McClellan's nerve. Pinkerton's flawed intelligence had completely convinced McClellan that he was vastly outnumbered. When Lee relentlessly attacked him day after day, it perfectly confirmed McClellan's deepest, most terrifying paranoid fears. McClellan completely lost his grip on reality. Instead of recognizing his massive numerical superiority and launching a devastating counterattack that could have easily broken through the thin Confederate lines and captured Richmond, McClellan panicked. He believed his magnificent, beautiful army was about to be completely surrounded and annihilated by a massive rebel horde. He ordered the entire massive Army of the Potomac to physically retreat away from Richmond. He called it a change of base, but it was an absolute, humiliating, terrifying retreat. In a moment of profound, absolute despair, McClellan sat in his tent and wrote a furious, borderline treasonous telegram directly to the United States Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. He explicitly blamed the government in Washington for the disaster, writing the most insubordinate sentence ever penned by an American general. "If I save this army now,
I tell you plainly that I owe no thanks to you or to any other persons in Washington. You have done your best to sacrifice this army." The Peninsula Campaign was a catastrophic, absolute failure. George McClellan had built the greatest, most magnificent, most lethal military machine in the history of the continent. He had brilliant logistics, superior numbers, better weapons, and men who absolutely adored him. But in the critical, terrifying moment of absolute chaos, he simply lacked the brutal, unforgiving nerve required to use it. Abraham Lincoln, deeply frustrated, exhausted, and desperately realizing that McClellan would never aggressively fight Robert E. Lee, finally ordered the entire Army of the Potomac to completely abandon the peninsula, load back onto the transport ships, and return to Washington in absolute, humiliating defeat. With the massive Union Army retreating in complete humiliation, the absolute strategic initiative of the war shifted violently, permanently into the hands of Robert E. Lee. Lee had saved the Confederate capital. He had psychologically broken the great young Napoleon, and now he realized that he could not win the war by simply fighting defensive battles in Virginia. He had to take the horrific, bloody terror of the war directly into the heart of the North.
In the late summer of 1862, Robert E. Lee made the most aggressive, terrifying, and brilliant gamble of his entire military career. He marched his exhausted, starving, but fiercely victorious Army of Northern Virginia completely out of the South. They splashed across the shallow waters of the Potomac River, and they invaded the United States of America. Abraham Lincoln was absolutely desperate. He knew that if Lee won a massive victory on Northern soil, the British Empire would finally intervene, European banks would fund the Confederacy, the Northern public would completely collapse, and the United States of America would permanently end. In a moment of pure, agonizing desperation, Lincoln was forced to turn back to the only man who could possibly organize the shattered federal troops in time to stop the invasion. He was forced to hand the sword back to the man he despised. He handed the army back to George McClellan. In video 46, we march to the bloodiest single day in the entire history of the United States. We will witness the incredible, mind-boggling miracle of the Lost Order, the exact moment the Union Army accidentally found Robert E. Lee's entire highly classified battle plan wrapped around 3 cigars in a field. We will follow the armies to a quiet, peaceful Maryland creek called Antietam, and we will watch in sheer, paralyzing horror as 23,000 American men are slaughtered in a single apocalyptic day of combat that would forever change the moral purpose of the war. Subscribe to Nostalgia History, share this vital history, and join us next time as the fate of the nation is decided in the bloodiest cornfield on Earth.